The ship had been dead for hours by the time Commander Silith Rowe brought her patrol cruiser down through the brown clouds of Verath 7. The moon was a wasteland, nothing but cracked stone and dust storms, and the kind of silence that made even veteran soldiers uneasy. And Silith had seen enough wreckage in her career to know what this was before her boots even touched the ground. It was a massacre. The destroyed vessel was scattered across nearly a full kilometer of barren terrain, metal torn apart like paper, cargo containers split open and spilling their contents into the dirt, and the unmistakable blackened scoring of Hekari plasma cannons burned into every surface. "Hekari raiders," her second-in-command Varric said, quietly, as he stepped down beside her, his crystalline skin catching the dim light of the distant sun. "No doubt about it." Silith said nothing and walked forward into the debris field, her long legs carrying her over twisted hull plating and shattered glass, and her crew followed behind her in tight formation, weapons drawn, scanners active. The ship was not registered in any Concord database, and the design was unlike anything Silith had seen in 20 years of service, and the materials were crude by galactic standards, heavy iron alloys, and polymer composites that seemed almost primitive. "Commander," Torek Vey called from ahead, the science officer crouching beside a body. "You need to see this." Silith approached and looked down. The creature was bipedal, soft-skinned, no scales or crystalline plating or chitin armor of any kind, just bare, vulnerable flesh, covered in a thin fabric garment now soaked dark with blood. And its face was flat with two forward-facing eyes, which meant predator, and its hands had 5 flexible digits, with short blunt claws that were clearly designed for gripping and manipulating. "Unknown species," Torek said, running his scanner over the body. "No match in any Concord record, no genetic profile on file, nothing." They found more bodies as they moved deeper into the wreckage. Dozens of them, all the same species, all dead, and Silith felt a cold weight settling in her chest, because these were not soldiers, and these were not smugglers. There were small personal belongings scattered everywhere, children's toys, and cooking implements, and bundles of clothing, and family photographs stored on primitive digital devices. And this had been a colony transport, a ship full of families going somewhere to start a new life. The Hrekari had killed them all. "Commander!" a voice shouted from the far side of the wreckage, sharp with alarm. "Commander, we have a live one!" Silith ran. She found Medic Dren kneeling beside a collapsed section of interior wall, and behind him 2 of her soldiers were pulling apart debris with urgent hands. And when Silith pushed through, she saw what they had found: 2 of the alien adults, 1 male and 1 female, based on their differing builds, lay crushed beneath a fallen support beam, and they were dead. Had been dead for hours, but their arms were wrapped around something between them, their bodies curled inward, like a shell, like armor, like a wall of flesh and bone, built to protect one single thing: a child. The little creature was alive, and it was screaming. The sound hit Silith like a physical force, not just the volume, which was startling from something so small, but the raw emotional weight of it. And beside her, she saw Varric stagger and press a hand to his temple, and Dren actually fell back a full step. "The psionic output," Dren gasped, his crystalline features flickering with color that meant pain. "Commander, the emotional broadcast from this creature is enormous. I have never felt anything like this. It is grief and terror and rage, all compressed into one signal, and it is broadcasting on every empathic frequency." Simultaneously, Silith gritted her teeth against the wave of anguish pouring off the child, and stepped forward and knelt down. The girl, she thought it was female, was tiny, barely reaching Silith's knee if she stood, covered in soot and dried blood that clearly was not hers, and her eyes were wide and wild and streaming with tears, and her small mouth was open, and she was screaming with a desperate animal fury that spoke of hours and hours of crying alone in the dark beside her dead parents. Easy, Silith said softly, reaching out one crystalline hand. Easy, little one. The child bit her. Silith jerked her hand back in shock, not from pain, because the tiny teeth could not penetrate her crystal skin, but from the sheer ferocity of the act. And this creature weighed perhaps 15 kilograms, and she had just tried to attack a Rithkai commander. Sedate her, Dren said, already preparing an injection. Standard pediatric dose adjusted for body. He administered the sedative. Nothing happened. The child kept screaming. Dren stared at his instruments, recalculated, and tried again at double the dose. The child's screaming got louder. Triple it, Silith ordered. Still nothing. Her metabolism, Torek said from behind them, his voice carrying a tone Silith had never heard from her unflappable science officer. Something between fascination and fear. Commander, her metabolic rate is extraordinary. Her body is burning through the sedative almost as fast as we administer it, and her core body temperature is nearly 40 degrees standard. That is lethally high for any known sapient species, but she appears to be functioning normally. Quadruple the dose, Silith said. Dren hesitated and looked at her with alarm. Do it. He did. The child's screams finally softened to whimpers, and then to silence, and her wild eyes fluttered and closed, and her tiny body went limp. Limp. And Silith caught her before she hit the ground and held her against her chest. She weighed almost nothing. What is she? Varric whispered. Torek was reading his scanner with an expression of open disbelief. Her bone density is remarkable. Her muscle fiber composition is unlike anything I have seen. She has a cardiovascular system that appears designed for sustained extreme exertion. And her immune system, he paused and shook his head. Her immune system appears to be at war with itself and everything around it simultaneously, and somehow winning on all fronts. What does that mean? Silith asked. It means, Torek said slowly, that whatever world this species comes from, it is not a gentle one. This child's biology reads like a survival mechanism evolved under conditions that would kill most concord species in hours. Silith looked down at the small creature in her arms, at the soot-streaked face, and the tiny hands still curled into fists, even in sleep. And she made a decision that she knew was against protocol, and against regulations, and against every standing order regarding uncontacted species. We are taking her with us, she said. Commander, Varric started. She is a child, Varric. She is alone. Her parents died protecting her, and I am not leaving her on this rock for a Concord processing facility to study like a specimen. Varric looked at her for a long moment, and then nodded. They carried her back to the ship, and Silith placed her in the medical bay herself, and stood there watching the monitors track the impossible vital signs of this impossible creature from an impossible world. And the child slept, with her fists still clenched, and her brow still furrowed, as if even in unconsciousness she was ready to fight. Silith placed her hand gently on the child's forehead, and felt the alarming heat radiating from that small body, and whispered a word in her own language. Kira, meant, found in fire. Behind her, Varric leaned against the doorframe and crossed his arms and said, The Concord will not be pleased about this. No, Silith agreed, not looking away from the child. They will not. We could face sanctions. You could lose your command. I know. You are doing it anyway. Silith looked at him then, her crystalline features set in an expression that left no room for argument. She was alone in the dark, Varric, beside the bodies of her parents, screaming for help in a language no one in this galaxy speaks. And we heard her. So yes, I am doing it anyway. Varric was quiet for a moment, and then said, What do you think we have gotten ourselves into? Silith looked back at the sleeping child, at the fists and the furrowed brow, and the impossible heat of a body built for a world that wanted to kill it every single day. I think, she said quietly, that we may have just made the mistake of our lives. For the first 5 days aboard the Rithkai patrol cruiser, She refused to eat anything that was offered to her, and instead stole food from the galley when she thought no one was watching, hiding pieces of it under the blanket in her medical bay bed, and in the corners of the room, and behind equipment panels, like a small animal preparing for a siege. She did not speak, or at least she did not speak in any language the ship's translation systems could parse, but sometimes at night the crew could hear her whispering to herself in the dark, strings of soft alien syllables that sounded like a song or a prayer, or maybe just the last words her mother had said to her. She watched everything. That was what unnerved the crew most. Not the biting or the hoarding or the feral hostility, but the watching, because Kira's eyes tracked every movement in the room with a speed and precision that the ship's AI flagged as extraordinary, and when someone entered her space, she would go perfectly still, and her gaze would lock onto them and follow them with the silent calculating focus of something that was deciding whether to run or fight. Predator response, Torek Vey told Silith during one of their evening briefings. Forward-facing binocular vision, rapid pupil dilation, heightened peripheral awareness. Everything about her visual system is optimized for tracking moving targets. She is 4 years old, Torek. She is 4 years old, and her biology is that of an apex predator from a world that the Concord would classify as a Class 12 death world, Torek replied, and he pulled up his research on the display. Weeks of analysis, compiled into a report that he had titled simply Preliminary Findings on Unknown Sapient Species, Designation Pending. What he had found was terrifying. The species, whatever they called themselves, were persistence predators, meaning they did not rely on speed or venom or camouflage to hunt, but instead simply followed their prey across vast distances without stopping, outlasting anything they chased through sheer relentless endurance until their target collapsed from exhaustion. Their skeletal structure was dense and heavy by galactic standards, reinforced with calcium deposits that made their bones resistant to impacts that would shatter Rithkai crystal, and their muscular system was a hybrid of fast-twitch and slow-twitch fibers that gave them both explosive power and sustained output. Their skin healed itself, not just closed wounds the way most species did, but actually generated new tissue to bridge gaps, leaving behind thickened ridges called scars that served as permanent reinforcement over previously damaged areas, meaning that every injury literally made them harder to injure in the same place again. Their immune system was perhaps the most alarming feature, a complex, multi-layered biological warfare network that identified foreign organisms and systematically destroyed them using chemical weapons manufactured inside the body itself. And when it encountered something it had not seen before, it learned from it and remembered it forever, and responded faster the next time. She is from a world where everything is trying to kill everything else all the time, Torek said, and her species did not survive by being the fastest or the strongest or the most venomous. They survived by being the most stubborn, by refusing to stop, by taking damage and healing and getting back up and continuing. Silith sat with this information for a long time. And emotionally? She asked. Torek hesitated. That is perhaps the most remarkable finding of all. Her species appears to form social bonds of extraordinary intensity. The psionic empathy readings we detected at the crash site were not an anomaly. She broadcasts her emotional state constantly and at a volume that suggests her species communicates as much through emotional resonance as through language. She feels things loudly, Silith said. She feels things at a volume that would be considered a disability in most Concord species, Torek corrected. And yet the intensity appears to be standard for her kind, meaning they are an entire species that feels everything at maximum intensity all the time. Silith thought about the dead parents wrapped around their child, about the arms that had held on even after death, about the love so fierce it had outlasted the bodies that carried it. She went to see Kira. The child was sitting on her bed with her knees drawn up to her chest, and her stolen food arranged in a careful circle around her. And when Silith entered, she went rigid, and her eyes locked on, and her small hands curled into fists. Silith did not approach. She sat down on the floor across the room, and she did not speak, and she did not reach out, and she did not try to take the food or move closer or do anything at all except be present. Kira watched her. Silith waited. An hour passed. Kira's fists slowly uncurled. Another hour, Kira's shoulders dropped from around her ears. A third hour, Kira picked up a piece of stolen bread and held it out towards Silith. Silith took it and ate it, even though it tasted terrible to her crystalline palate. And Kira watched her chew, and something shifted in those predator eyes. Something that was not trust exactly, but was perhaps the first fragile step toward it. Silith came back the next day, and did the same thing, and the next day, and the next. And slowly over the course of weeks, Kira began to unfold, began to make sounds that were directed at Silith rather than whispered to herself, began to mimic Rithkai words with a speed that amazed the linguistics team. Her language acquisition rate is unprecedented, the ship's communication officer reported. She is not just memorizing vocabulary, she is intuiting grammatical structures from context. She figured out our verb conjugation system in 4 days. It takes Rithkai children 2 years. By the time the ship reached Concord Relay 11, Kira could speak broken but functional Rithkai, and she followed Silith everywhere, like a small shadow, one hand always reaching up to grip the edge of Silith's uniform. And she still flinched when strangers came too close, but she no longer bit them. The station was enormous, a spinning city in space where dozens of species lived and worked and traded, and Kira stared at everything with those huge tracking eyes, overwhelmed and terrified and fascinated all at once. The trouble came on the second day. Delegate Fail of the Mivrani arrived with a formal Concord order, a tall thin being with 4 arms and skin like polished copper, and a voice that carried the particular coldness of someone who had spent their entire life in bureaucracy. The child is to be remanded to Concord Xenobiological Services for evaluation and classification, he said, standing in Silith's quarters with 2 armed escorts behind him. This is not a request, Commander. This is a directive from the Interspecies Contact Authority. She has a name, Silith said. It is Kira. It is an uncontacted sapient from an unclassified death world, and it represents a potential biological threat to Concord populations, Fail replied without emotion. Preliminary reports indicate a hyper-aggressive immune system, abnormal physical capabilities, and uncontrolled psionic emissions. The child must be studied. Studied, Silith repeated, and the word tasted like poison. Evaluated, assessed, contained if necessary. This is standard protocol for first contact with potentially dangerous species, and you know this. I know that your standard protocol would put a traumatized orphan in a laboratory. I know that your emotional attachment to this creature is compromising your... They stared at each other across the room, and the air between them was sharp with tension. And behind Silith in the small sleeping area, Kira was listening to every word, understanding perhaps half of it, but feeling all of it, because she always felt everything. Kira stood up. She walked out of the sleeping area on her small bare feet, with her stolen bread still clutched in one hand, and she walked past Delegate Fail without looking at him, and she walked to Silith and reached up and took her crystalline hand. The contact was electric. Silith felt it pour through her like a wave, the child's emotions transmitted through skin contact with staggering clarity and force. And it was not words, because Kira did not have enough words yet, but it was a feeling so pure, and so desperate, and so achingly clear that language was unnecessary. Please do not leave me. Please do not leave me. I am scared. You are the only safe thing I have. Please. Silith's hand closed around Kira's tiny fingers, and she looked at Delegate Fail with eyes that had gone from diplomatic to dangerous. "File your protest," she said quietly. "She stays with me." Fail stared at them for a long moment, the towering crystalline officer and the tiny alien child holding hands in the middle of the room, and something flickered across his copper features that might have been surprise, or might have been contempt. "You are making a mistake, Commander." "I have been told that before." Fail turned and left with his escorts, and the door closed behind him, and Kira pressed her face against Silith's leg and held on with both hands, and did not let go for a very long time. That night, Silith sat beside Kira's bed as the child fell asleep, and she watched the monitors tracking that impossible heartbeat and that impossible temperature. And she thought about what Torek had said about a species that felt everything at maximum intensity all then. She reached out and brushed a strand of dark hair from Kira's forehead, and the child stirred and murmured something in her sleep. Not Rithkai, but that other language, the lost one, the one from the burning ship. And Silith did not understand the words, but she understood the feeling behind them, because Kira was always broadcasting. And it said, in the language of a dead world, carried in a living child. Kira was 10 years old now, tall for her age by human standards, and still absurdly small by Rithkai ones. And she lived with Silith in a quiet residential district on Solvin Prime, the Rithkai homeworld, a planet of crystal spires and low gravity and soft harmonic resonance fields that hummed through the air like music you could feel in your bones. She had grown up here, and she loved it, and she did not belong. She knew this the way she knew everything, loudly and completely and with her whole body, because every single day reminded her that she was not like the others, and every single day she woke up and tried anyway. The Rithkai were beautiful, tall and elegant, with skin like living gemstone that shifted color with their moods. And they moved through their world with a grace that made everything they did look like a slow dance. And their children were quiet and thoughtful and precise, and they studied in careful structured patterns, and they solved problems through logic and harmony and patience. Kira was loud. She laughed too hard, and the sound bounced off crystal walls and startled people. And she ran everywhere instead of walking, because her body burned with a restless energy that the low gravity of Solvin Prime only made worse. And she ate with her hands sometimes, when she forgot herself. And she talked with her whole body moving, arms waving, face shifting through expressions so fast that Rithkai children would stare at her as if watching a storm. She was also always warm, a furnace wrapped in soft brown skin. And when she sat next to her classmates, they would shift away from her unconsciously, because her body temperature was nearly 12 degrees higher than theirs, and it made them uncomfortable. She had scars, a long one on her left knee from falling off a wall she should not have been climbing, a small one on her chin from a collision with a doorframe she had not seen. And her classmates had never seen scars before, because Rithkai bodies healed perfectly without marks. And they would look at her damaged skin with a mixture of curiosity and faint horror, as if she were carrying proof of something violent written on her body. She was, and the violence was called living, but she was brilliant. Her tutors admitted this even when they did not know what to do with her, because Kira did not learn the way Rithkai children learned. She did not move through problems in orderly steps from beginning to end. Instead, she would stare at a problem, and then leap sideways to an answer that came from somewhere no one could trace, intuitive and reckless, and almost always correct. "She does not think in lines," her primary tutor told Silith during a progress review. "She thinks in webs, in explosions. She sees connections between things that have no logical connection, and then she pulls them together into solutions that work, even though they should not." "Is that a problem?" asked. "It is a problem because I cannot teach her," the tutor admitted. "I show her the method, and she ignores it, and arrives at the answer through some path I cannot follow. and I do not know whether to praise her or discipline her." "Praise her," Silith said. The other children were less generous. They did not bully her exactly, because Rithkai children were not raised for cruelty, but they kept their distance, a gap that was polite and constant and absolute. And Kira felt it every day, like a bruise that never healed. Because she wanted so badly to be one of them, and she could not be. She could never be. Her body was wrong, and her voice was wrong, and her temperature was wrong, and her feelings were too big for any room she walked into. She told Silith about it once, sitting on the balcony of their home, with her legs dangling over the edge, and her face turned toward a sky full of stars she could not name. "They are not mean to me," she said carefully. In perfect Rithkai, with only the faintest trace of an accent she could not identify. "They are just not close to me. They stand next to each other, and I can see that they fit together like pieces of something, and I am the piece from a different puzzle." Silith sat beside her, and said nothing for a moment, because she had learned over 6 years that sometimes Kira needed silence more than solutions. "You are not from a different puzzle," Silith said finally. "You are from a different box, and that means you see the picture differently, and that is not less, Kira. That is more." Kira leaned against her, and Silith felt the heat of her through her crystalline skin, and the hum of her emotions underneath. And the dominant feeling was a loneliness so vast it could fill a planet. Then the wilderness simulation happened. It was a standard exercise for Rithkai youth, a controlled environment designed to teach survival basics in a safe and monitored setting. Challenges with gentle consequences, and Kira's class of 30 students was led into the simulation chamber on a bright morning, with their instructor explaining each stage in calm, measured tones. The malfunction happened 20 minutes in. A power surge cascaded through the environmental controls, and suddenly the gentle simulation was not gentle anymore. Real temperature spikes, and real atmospheric shifts, and real structural failures, as ceiling panels cracked and walls buckled, and emergency lighting replaced the soft artificial daylight with harsh red strobes. The Rithkai children froze. Every single one of them stopped moving, their crystalline skin flickering with the pale blue of confusion and the deep violet of fear. And they looked to their instructor, who was also frozen, because Rithkai were creatures of order and structure and harmony, and when the structure broke, they needed a moment to rebuild it inside themselves before they could act. Kira did not. Something shifted behind her eyes, something old and deep, and inherited from 100,000 generations of ancestors who had survived on a world that tried to kill them every single day. And her body moved before her mind finished thinking. She grabbed the 2 nearest children by their arms and pulled them away from a collapsing ceiling panel half a second before it crashed down where they had been standing. And she shoved them toward the emergency corridor and shouted in a voice that cut through the chaos like a blade, "Move! Move now! Go that way! Do not stop!" She went back for more. She carried a smaller child on her back and dragged another by the hand. And she navigated the failing simulation by instinct, reading the sounds of stressed metal and the shifts in air pressure the way her ancestors had read weather and predator movements. And when she reached a sealed emergency door that would not open, she punched the wall panel beside it hard, enough to crack the housing, and ripped the manual release lever free, and hauled the door open with both hands. Her wrist broke. She heard the snap, and felt the white-hot flare of pain shoot up her arm, and she did not stop. She did not even slow down. She shifted the injured hand to a support position, and kept pulling children through the doorway with her good hand, and her voice, and her sheer stubborn refusal to let the situation win. By the time the facility staff overrode the malfunction and restored control, Kira had moved 19 children to safety, including 3 she had physically carried. She was standing in the corridor with her broken wrist held against her chest, and her face white with pain she had not allowed herself to feel until now. And around her, 19 Rithkai children were staring at her with expressions she had never seen directed at her before. Some of it was gratitude. Some of it was awe. Some of it was fear. Was complicated. The parents of the rescued children were grateful and also terrified, because their sons and daughters came home with stories about the human girl who had moved through chaos like she was born in it, who had broken her own bones and kept going as if pain were just another sensation to be filed away and dealt with later. And these parents looked at Kira and saw something they did not have a word for. The Academy Board convened a review, and there were voices calling for Kira's removal, not because she had done anything wrong, but because her very nature was a disruption, because she was a reminder that the galaxy contained things that did not fit neatly into categories, things that were wild and loud and scarred and burning. Silith prepared to fight for her again, but Kira asked to speak for herself. She stood before the board, 10 years old, with her wrist in a healing cast, and her dark hair pulled back from a face that was trying very hard to be calm. And she spoke in flawless Rithkai, with a voice that only trembled twice. "I know what I am," she said. "I know I am loud and I break things, and I am too warm and I scare people. I know that I do not fit the way your children fit, and I know that my body works differently, and my feelings are too big, and my instincts come from a place that frightens you." She paused and swallowed hard. "But I also know that when it went wrong in there, I did not leave anyone behind. I went back. I went back every time because that is what I am too. I am not just the scary parts. I am also the part that goes back." Her voice cracked and she steadied it with visible effort. "I do not know how to be less than what I am, but I can promise to use all of it for you. Every loud, scary, broken part of me. I will use it for you if you let me stay." The board was silent for a very long time. They let her stay. That night, Kira stood alone on the balcony and looked up at the alien stars, and somewhere behind her eyes, there was a memory she could barely reach anymore, the warmth of arms around her, and a voice singing words she was forgetting. And she whispered in a language that was becoming a ghost inside her. "Mom, Dad, I am trying." The stars did not answer, but Silith, standing unseen in the doorway behind her, heard the words she did not understand, and felt the emotion she did not need to translate. And she thought, not for the first time, that the universe had a strange and terrible sense of humor, to take a child from fire and give her to crystal, and expect them both to survive it. But they were surviving it. Kira was 17 years old when the galaxy learned what a human was. She had spent 7 more years on Solvan Prime after the Academy incident, growing taller and stronger and sharper in ways that continued to quietly terrify every xenobiologist who studied her case from a safe academic distance. And she had earned a place in the Rithkai diplomatic service, not because anyone thought a human belonged there, but because Silith had pulled every string she had, and because Kira had scored higher on the strategic aptitude examinations than any candidate in 11 years. She still did not fit in. She had simply gotten better at carrying the weight of not fitting in. Concord Relay 11 was supposed to be a routine diplomatic posting. 3 days of interspecies trade negotiations aboard the massive orbital station, where Kira would observe and learn and stay quiet, and not frighten anyone with her predator eyes and her impossible body temperature. Approximately 4 hours. The Hikari had been growing bolder for years, their raiding parties pushing deeper into Concord space, testing boundaries, probing defenses. And the Concord had responded the way the Concord always responded, with strongly worded diplomatic protests and committee hearings and formal expressions of concern that the Hikari ignored completely, because the Hikari did not care about words. They cared about weakness, and they had found plenty of it. The assault came without warning. 30 Hikari warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel in a tight formation around Relay 11 and opened fire simultaneously, and the station's shields held for exactly 9 minutes before collapsing under concentrated plasma bombardment. And then the boarding craft launched, hundreds of them, slamming into the station's hull like metal parasites and cutting through with breaching charges. Kira was in the diplomatic quarter when the first explosion rocked the station, and she was on her feet and moving before the emergency alarms even finished their first cycle, and the Rithkai diplomats around her were frozen in that terrible familiar stillness of a species confronting chaos without a protocol to follow. She found Silith in the corridor outside, and their eyes met, and something passed between them that did not need words. 13 years of love and exasperation and fierce protective loyalty compressed into a single glance. "Get the civilians to the interior safe rooms," Kira said. "Kira, you are not a soldier. Neither are the Hikari going to care about that. Go. I will buy you time." Silith grabbed her arm, and Kira felt the crystalline fingers dig in with desperate strength. "Do not die. I will do my best." Then Silith was gone, herding civilians with the calm authority of a veteran commander, and Kira turned toward the sound of plasma fire and screaming, and she ran toward it. Seen in the station's main concourse was carnage. Hikari soldiers poured through 3 separate breach points, tall, armored reptilian creatures with 4 arms and bioluminescent eyes that burned orange in the emergency lighting. And they moved with the efficient brutality of a species that had been raiding and killing since before they achieved spaceflight. The Concord security forces were fighting back, but they were losing, their formations breaking apart under the ferocity of the assault. Their training designed for orderly engagements, not desperate corridor warfare. And Kira could see the moment approaching when their morale would crack, and they would run, and then everyone on this station would die. She grabbed a fallen security officer's weapon and checked its charge, and then she did something that no one on that station expected. She started giving orders. Her voice cut through the chaos, the way it had cut through the Academy simulation 7 years ago. Sharp and clear and carrying a certainty that was not logical but was absolutely real. And the surviving defenders looked at her and saw not a 17-year-old girl, but something their instincts recognized, even if their minds did not. A predator in its element, a creature that had been built for exactly this moment by a world that did not forgive weakness. "You 3, barricade that corridor, use the cargo containers, stack them deep. The Hikari are strong, but they are not patient. Make them work for every meter. You, reroute the station's fire suppression system to this junction. Set it to maximum output. The foam will blind them and clog their respiratory filters. You 2, pull the power cells from those lighting panels and wire them to the deck plating at that choke point. When I give the signal, you activate them, and anything standing on that section of floor gets the worst surprise of their lives." They listened. They did not know why they listened, but they did. Creatures from 6 different species, following the commands of a human girl, because something in her voice and her posture and the way she moved through the burning station told them that she knew what she was doing, even if she had never done it before. Kira fought alongside them. She was not the strongest fighter on the station, and she was not the most skilled, and she did not have armor or training or experience, but she had something that none of the Concord species had, and that even the Hikari had not counted on. She would not stop. A plasma bolt grazed her shoulder, and she kept moving, the wound cauterized and raw, and screaming with pain that she acknowledged and then filed away, in the place where humans put pain when there was work to do. A piece of shrapnel caught her across the ribs, and she felt something crack, and she adjusted her breathing to compensate, and kept fighting. A Hikari soldier, twice her size, grabbed her in the corridor, and slammed her against a wall, and she felt her vision go white and then red. And then she drove her forehead into the creature's face with the full force of a Death World skull that had evolved to protect the most dangerous brain in the galaxy. And the Hikari staggered, and she took its weapon and kept moving. She is still going, she heard someone whisper behind her, a Valorian soldier who had been fighting beside her for 20 minutes, and had watched her take wounds that would have killed him. How is she still going? She was still going, because that was what humans did. They did not stop. They had never stopped. 1,000,000 years of evolution on a world that threw everything it had at them, and they just kept getting up, kept adapting, kept fighting, kept reaching for each other in the dark, and saying, "Not yet. Not today. I am not done." The turning point came in the station's central hub. A HFY war captain had pushed through the defensive lines with a squad of elite soldiers, and they had cornered a group of civilians, including Silith, who had refused to leave until every last person was evacuated. Because that was who Silith was. That was who she had always been. Kira arrived at a dead sprint, with blood running down her face from a cut above her eye, and her weapons spent and useless. The war captain was enormous, the largest HFY she had ever seen, armored in black chitin plating, with ceremonial kill marks etched into every surface, and it turned its burning orange eyes toward her, and let out a sound that was half roar and half laugh, because she was small and bleeding and human, and what could she possibly do? Kira dropped the empty weapon. She looked at Silith behind the war captain. Silith, who had found her in fire. Silith, who had sat on the floor for 3 hours, waiting for a feral child to offer her bread. Silith, who had fought the entire galaxy to keep her. And something erupted from inside Kira that was older than language and deeper than thought. She charged. The fight was brutal and short and ugly, and nothing like the elegant combat the Concord species practiced. It was a death-world animal fighting for someone she loved. All teeth and elbows and ferocity, and a broken rib grinding against itself with every movement. And when the war captain threw her down, she got up, and when it cut her, she bled and kept coming, and when it roared, she roared back. The sound that came out of Kira's throat was not a word in any language. It was the sound of a species that had been screaming at the dark since before it learned to make fire. A howl of defiance that said, "I am small, and I am bleeding, and I am afraid, and I do not care, because you will not touch what is mine." She killed the war captain with her bare hands when her last weapon shattered, driving it to the ground with a technique that was not technique at all, but pure desperate animal will. And she stood over Silith's body, and faced the remaining HFY soldiers, and she roared again, blood-soaked and broken and absolutely unbreakable. They retreated. 6 elite HFY warriors looked at one human girl, standing in a pool of her own blood, with fire in her eyes and death in her hands, and they retreated. When the Concord reinforcements arrived, 30 minutes later, they found the station saved, and the HFY in full withdrawal, and a 17-year-old human collapsed on the deck of the central hub, with Silith cradling her head and whispering her name. Kira looked up at Silith, with eyes that were going unfocused, and she smiled with bloody teeth and said, "I told you I would do my best." Silith held her tighter, and her crystalline skin was flickering every color at once, which meant she was feeling everything at maximum intensity, for perhaps the first time in her ordered, elegant life. "You impossible creature," she whispered. "I learned from the best," Kira said, and then she passed out. In the medical bay afterward, Delegate Fail stood in the doorway and looked at the human girl lying unconscious on the table, held together with emergency sutures and biofoam, and the stubborn refusal of a death-world body to stop working. He said nothing for a long time. Then he turned to Silith and said quietly, "I am withdrawing my case." Silith did not look at him, her eyes fixed on Kira's face. "Why?" Fail was silent for another moment, and when he spoke his voice carried something it had never carried before. "Because I was wrong about what she is." He left, and Silith sat beside Kira and held her burning hand, and listened to the impossible heartbeat on the monitor, steady and strong, and stubborn as the species it belonged to. Outside the medical bay, in corridors still scorched with plasma fire and littered with debris, the survivors of 6 different species talked in quiet voices about what they had seen, about the human girl who had taken command and taken wounds and taken on a war captain twice her size and won. They did not call her the Mistake anymore. They did not know what to call her, but they knew they were alive because of her. 2 years after the Battle of Relay 11, Kira stood in a room that held the fate of her entire species, and she was terrified. She did not show it, because she had spent 19 years learning how to carry fear without letting it carry her. But it was there beneath her ribs, like a second heartbeat, fast and hot and human. The Grand Assembly Hall of the Galactic Concord was the largest enclosed space Kira had ever seen. A vast circular chamber carved from living crystal on the neutral world of Thessarin, with tiered seating rising in concentric rings around a central platform. And every seat was filled. 42 species, thousands of delegates, millions of eyes watching through broadcast feeds across 100 star systems. And in the center of it all, alone on the speaking platform, with nothing but a translator implant, and the scars on her body, and the fire in her blood, one human girl from a dead ship on a barren moon. Display screen hung an image of Earth, blue and green and white, wrapped in clouds, spinning in the black. And it was the most beautiful thing Kira had ever seen, even though she could not remember it, even though she had left it when she was too young to know what leaving meant. The assembly had been in session for 3 days before Kira was allowed to speak, and she had sat in the gallery and listened to every word. She had listened to the Mivrani delegate present the xenobiological reports with clinical precision, describing humanity as a Class 12 Death World species, with persistence predator biology and hyper-aggressive immune response and abnormal emotional intensity. And the words were accurate, and they made her people sound like a disease. She had listened to the Valorian delegate show the footage from Relay 11, Kira covered in blood and roaring over the body of a fallen war captain. And the footage was real, and it made her people look like monsters. Had listened to the Theric delegate argue that allowing contact with Earth was inviting a predator species into a community of prey, that humanity's biology and psychology made them inherently dangerous, that the galaxy had survived this long by keeping Death World species contained, and it should continue to do so. She had listened to a dozen more voices say variations of the same thing. Humans were strong, and humans were terrifying, and humans were a mistake of evolution that should be studied from a safe distance and never, never, never invited to sit at the table with civilized beings. And through all of it, she had sat still and quiet, and let the words wash over her. And she had thought about Silith sitting on a cold metal floor for 3 hours, waiting for a feral child to share bread with her. Now it was her turn. She walked to the center of the platform, and she looked up at the thousands of faces looking down at her. And she took one breath, and then another. Began. She said, and her voice was steady, even though her hands were shaking at her sides. That is not the name my parents gave me. I do not remember that name. I do not remember their faces. I do not remember the sound of their voices, or the words of the songs they sang to me. All of that burned on a moon called Vareth 7 when I was 4 years old. The hall was silent. What I do remember is the dark. I remember being alone in the dark, with my parents' arms still around me, even though they could no longer hold me. And I remember screaming. I remember screaming until my throat bled, because I was small, and I was alone, and the universe had just shown me exactly how much it did not care about one small girl from one small world. She paused and let the silence hold. And then someone came. She looked up to the Rithkai section of the gallery, where Silith sat in her formal uniform, with her crystalline hands folded in her lap, and her skin shimmering with colors that Kira had learned to read like a second language over 15 years. Commander Silith Rowe of the Rithkai Patrol Service found me in the wreckage, and I bit her, and I screamed at her, and I stole food from her ship, and I broadcast my grief so loudly that her empathic crew members could not stand in the same room with me. A murmur rippled through the assembly. And she kept me anyway. She sat on the floor and she waited for me. She did not force me, and she did not study me, and she did not put me in a container and label me as a threat. She just waited until I was ready to reach out, and when I reached out she was there. Kira's voice cracked, and she let it crack because she was human, and humans did not hide what they felt. Not really, not when it mattered. I have listened to 3 days of debate about what my species is, and I want to tell you that everything you have said is true. The murmuring stopped. Persistence predators, we are Deathworlders. We evolved on a planet that tried to kill us every single day, and we survived not because we were the fastest or the strongest, but because we absolutely refused to stop. You are right about that. She turned slowly, meeting eyes across every section of the gallery. We are aggressive. We are loud. We feel everything too much. Our bodies run hot, and our emotions run hotter. We scar instead of healing clean because our biology decided that remembering damage was more important than erasing it. We are everything you are afraid of, and I am not going to stand here and pretend otherwise. She stopped turning and faced the full assembly. But you are missing something. She held up her hand, the one that had been broken at 10 years old, and broken again at 17, and still carried the scars of both. This hand broke a wall panel to get 19 children to safety. This hand held a dying soldier's hand on Relay 11, so he would not be alone when he passed. This hand held my mother's hand as she taught me to walk on a world I will never see again. She lowered it. You look at humans and you see a threat. You see a Deathworld species with dangerous biology and violent instincts. And I understand that, because I have spent my entire life being too much for every room I walk into. Too loud, too warm, too fast, too intense, too alive. Her eyes were bright, but she did not let the tears fall. But what you do not see is what comes with all of that, because the same species that fights like we fight also loves like we love, and we love so hard it terrifies us. We love our children so much that our bodies will keep holding them after we die. We love our friends so much that we will break our own bones to carry them to safety. We love strangers so much that we will bleed for people whose names we do not know. She took a step forward. My parents died wrapped around me. Is what humans do. We wrap ourselves around the things we love, and we do not let go. Not when it is hard, not when it hurts, not when it kills us. We hold on. She looked at Silith again. Commander Rowe was told she was making a mistake when she took me from that wreckage. Delegate Fail called me a mistake. Your biological reports call my entire species a mistake. A Deathworld anomaly that should not exist. She smiled, and it was fierce and gentle at the same time. Maybe we are a mistake. Maybe a Class 12 Deathworld should not produce sapient life. Maybe evolution got confused and made something too strong, and too stubborn, and too full of feeling for this quiet, orderly galaxy of yours. She spread her hands. But Silith made a mistake too. She picked up a screaming alien child instead of following protocol. She broke the rules because a little girl was alone in the dark, and that mistake grew up and fought for your station, and bled for your people, is standing here today, asking you to take a chance. Her voice rose, not to a shout, but to something stronger, something that resonated in the crystal walls and in the bones of every being in the room. Maybe the universe does not make mistakes. Maybe it makes survivors, and then it puts them where they are needed. She extended her hand, palm up, reaching out to the assembly in a gesture that was purely human and completely instinctive. The offer of contact, the invitation to trust, the oldest and simplest promise her species knew. My name is Kira. I was found in fire. My people come from a world of storms and predators and pain and beauty, and we have been reaching for the stars since before we had words for what they were." She held her hands steady. "Let me show you what humanity can be." The silence was enormous. It filled the hall like water, pressing against every surface, and Kira stood in the center of it, with her hand extended, and her heart hammering, and her whole body burning at the temperature of a world that had forged her species in blood and sunlight. Then, a sound. A single chair sliding back in the Rithkai section. Silith stood, tall and shimmering, and she walked down from the gallery and across the assembly floor, and every eye in the room tracked her, and she reached Kira and looked down at the girl she had pulled from fire 15 years ago. She took Kira's hand. Kira's fingers closed around the cool crystal, and Silith's fingers closed around the burning skin, and the contact was what it had always been, a bridge between two worlds that should never have met. A second chair slid back in the Valorian section, a soldier who had fought beside Kira at Relay 11, and he stood. A third in the Theric section, a delegate who had argued against contact, but who was looking at Kira's outstretched hand with something shifting behind his eyes. A fourth, a fifth, a dozen, 2 dozen. A wave rising through the gallery as delegates stood one by one, and then in clusters, and then in whole sections. Not because they were unafraid, but because a 19-year-old girl from a burning ship had just shown them that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision that something else mattered more. Kira felt the tears come, and she let them fall, because she was human, and humans cried. They cried when they were sad, and they cried when they were happy, and they cried when the universe that had taken everything from them turned around and offered something back. She held Silith's hand, and she looked out at the rising assembly through blurred vision, and she felt in her chest the echo of a heartbeat she could no longer remember, her mother's or her father's, or maybe just the heartbeat of a species that had been trying to reach this moment since the first human looked up at the night sky and wondered what was out there. And the galaxy looked back at her. This impossible girl from an impossible world. This screaming child turned diplomat, turned warrior, turned bridge between stars. And it began to understand what Silith had understood 15 years ago, on a barren moon beside a burning ship. That the universe does not make mistakes. It makes humans, and it puts them where they are needed. And that is the most terrifying and beautiful thing of all.